This lecture will look at the rise of hip hop as a form of social commentary in Africa, specifically looking at kind of the arrival of hip hop in Africa, the conditions in Africa at the time that made the music genre so attractive to young people and which would eventually be used by young people as a tool for social and political commentary. So hip hop arrives in Africa in the 1980s and the 1990s. By the mid 1990s, hip hop would be one of the dominant music genres throughout urban Africa. So there are four factors or elements of kind of hip hop's arrival in Africa that are important. And the first we're going to look at is urbanization, the role of rural to urban migration. The second is we're going to be looking at the role of poverty and kind of how poverty pushed many youth towards hip hop. We're going to look at the presence and size of youth populations in Africa and the role of migrant returnees in Africa and their impact on the spread of hip hop in Africa. Now, when we look at urbanization, Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing region in the world. A significant percentage of the population in most African countries now lives in the cities. So, for example, in 1960, only about 15% of the populations in most African countries were living in the cities. By 2010, that had increased to 50% of the populations in most African countries living in the urban areas. Now, this had many impacts, but specifically on the economy, it put an increased pressure on the job market. People weren't able to get jobs very easily because the massive population of people to the urban areas, there weren't enough jobs to go around. And so what happened was you saw a significant growth in the informal economy. And so these are individuals who are operating outside of formal job structures. And so often these are, street vendors, people in the market, people who are working on the buses. So there are several jobs within the informal job market, and many people throughout Africa who moved to the urban areas ended up working in that informal job market. Now, rural to urban migration also has significant impact on social services. So one example is the increase in deaths from preventable diseases, which was a direct result of there being a lack of adequate healthcare facilities to manage the increased population. Another segment of the community that was impacted was housing, the housing market. So because there wasn't enough housing to accommodate this rapidly growing urban population, we see the rise of informal settlements and ghettos. These are communities that are overcrowded. These are communities where homes are basically built by whatever resources migrants could get their hands on. These are often communities with no running water, no electricity, no sewage or poor sewage facilities, and no trash collection, and which also kind of leads us back to the deaths from preventable diseases. The population growth also would kind of put pressure on the schools, which became overcrowded or unavailable for many who would then turn around and drop out and join the informal economy. The infrastructure was also impacted by migration. We saw an increase in traffic. We saw tax on the public transportation system. And so we saw the emergence of kind of this private minivans that would come in and supplement the public bus system, which wasn't able to accommodate the increased population. The stress on the power infrastructure, communication networks, and road repairs, which often were not done because of the lack of resources. So poverty was also one of the underlying factors in all of this, along with the significant youth population. So in many African countries, over 50% of the population is under 30. So you have a significant youth population, and many of those youth in the urban areas specifically have found it hard to find employment. And so many of them would also join the informal market. Now, all of this impacts hip hop because you had individuals who were listening to this new music coming from the United States and were able to identify with the conditions, the living conditions that were described in the music. So, the artists that were writing about poverty in the South Bronx, life in the South Bronx, the violence, the dilapidated housing, the interactions with the police. Many individuals who were living in areas like Nima in Accra, Ghana, or Temeke in Dar es Salaam, or the Kibera slums in Nairobi were able to identify with those living conditions, with those environments. And so many of them would also hear the songs of artists like Public Enemy, and would then kind of take on many of those same perspectives and ideologies, listening to the music and producing similar music that dealt with many of those social issues. Now, in terms of African migration, African migrants would play a significant role in the spread of hip hop in Africa. So in the 1980s, we saw specifically a significant increase in African migration to the United States. The African immigrant population in America would continue to grow from the 1980s onward. And what happened was many of those migrants would return to Africa with hip hop music, videos, magazines, dance styles, and stories. And so the youth would then kind of, get this information, and this would also kind of help spread and inform the growing hip hop scene there. So for example, someone comes home back to Ghana, they have the new Public Enemy tape. That tape would often make it around the neighborhood with people copying it, and that would also kind of be an influence on the budding hip hop communities in those areas. And so when we look at hip hop in Africa, specifically coming out of the late 80s in the 1990s, we see a very clear identification with the living conditions in places like the South Bronx by youth